Good morning from Malta, and welcome to the fourth webinar in a series of 6 webinars focusing on museum futures. For those who are joining us for the first time, my name is Carmen Borch. I am the head of the Department of Arts, Open Communities and Adult Education within the Faculty of Education, University of Malta. We are hosting this webinar as an extension to our specialized program in museum education, and also as a prelude to a very important event which is happening next year, in October next year, which in the form of an international conference entitled MUŻE.X, Shaping Museum Futures. I want to extend my welcome to include our main collaborator, that's Spazio Creative Space. We are transmitting from their cinema theater, one of the multiple spaces that constitute this marvelous infrastructure housed within a 16th century, space. I also want to thank our main sponsor, Valletta Cultural Agency. I'm not alone in organizing this webinar series. Behind the scenes, we have Joe Vansel, who's responsible for monitoring the quality of the transmission and for registrations. We have Matthew behind the camera. Of course, from Portland, Oregon, I salute. A very good early morning to you, Mike Murovsky. And to my left, Sandro De Bono, a dear friend, collaborator and associate of the department. I'm raring to go, full of enthusiasm. So I leave the mic to Sandro to introduce the speaker of today.
Good morning, Carmel. Good morning, Mike. How are you? It is indeed a pleasure for me to be introducing today's speaker and guest. I must confess, Kristin is a person whom I met over the last year and a half, 2 years. I happened to attend a session of hers in one of We Are Museum's conferences, and I was very much inspired by her thoughts, by her work, and by her vision. For those of you who don't know Kristin, she is the director of the Futurist Museum, MOD, which was inaugurated in 2018. So it's quite one of the latest additions to this web of international museums focusing on futures. Before that, she was also the founding director of Foresight Agency, Bridge 18, and her interests are quite extensive, ranging from facilitating futures on engagement, on water sustainability, nanotechnology, health advanced manufacturing, clear technology. The list is endless. Kristin, welcome to this series of webinars. It's indeed a pleasure to have you with us, and looking forward to hear your thoughts and your ideas and to some good conversations afterwards. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sandro and Carmel. It's an absolute pleasure to be considered as part of this series that you've organised, and I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to share some of the things that we've been doing this year to manage what has obviously been a really difficult year for so many people. So as Sandro said, I'm the director of MOD. MOD is a museum that's part of the University of Adelaide, based in South Australia, in Australia. And the purpose of MOD is to inspire young adults about science and tech careers, and to do that in a way that really showcases the research of the university as well. So we use this as our guiding principle to be Australia's leading future-focused museum. So as Sandra said, I got a range of diverse interests, but one of those interests is in strategic foresight. I completed my master's about 10 years ago now, and really have been applying some of those future literacies to the way that we think about the development of MOD. The other thing that we are very conscious about doing is provoking new ideas by showcasing the research of the university and of the state. And we really want people thinking about what's coming and what might evolve. And we do that at this intersection of science, art and innovation. So for us, it is around promoting involvement in science, technology, engineering and maths. but also it's about getting people who are interested in design or art to be more conscious about some of those digital and computational literacies that we need for the sort of world that we're building. I mentioned that I'm based in Adelaide, and I wanted to start by showing you this exhibit, which was part of our Waging Peace exhibition in 2018. And this exhibit we worked with Michelle Mageis, who's a design student at the university, to bring to the fore what some of the traditional practices of Aboriginal and First Nations people are in Australia. So in South Australia, there's actually 44 different language groups. And each of their names are on those flags, along with some of the words for welcome. So I just wanted to acknowledge that Adelaide is on Kaurna land, and that I'd pay my respects to the Kaurna Mino. And it's really important for us at MUŻ to be, I guess, conscious about how grateful we are to be on Kaurna land, and to bring that through into our exhibitions. And the reason I wanted to start with that is partly because when I first had the opportunity to set MUŻ up, I was very much thinking about what is the purpose of what we're trying to do, and what makes us, I guess, different or unique. And thinking about our role in Adelaide and in South Australia was very much part of that early thinking. The picture that you can see now is a very old gum tree, which is in the north of Adelaide, in a suburb of Salisbury. You can see there's a mark on the trunk of the tree, which is thought to be from where a shield has been carved out of that tree. And so, you know, this tree is very, very old and predates, obviously, English settlement. And thinking about being on Kaurna land and thinking about, you know, what we wanted to do with a very future-focused museum prompted me to think about a couple of things. So the first was the words of Uncle Lewis O'Brien, who, when I spoke to him about what we wanting to do, reminded me that Kaurna Yurta is actually a place of learning, and always has been a place of learning. And so to continue to think about this land that we're on as a place of learning is important. And then I was reminded of the work of futurist Richard Slaughter and his thinking about this idea of the 200-year present, which is not unique to him. And a lot of you will be familiar with ideas around sort of 7 generations of thinking, or long-term futures thinking. The 200-year present, as Richard describes, is being able to stand in the center of those 200 years and think back 100 years to knowing your grandparents, and forward 100 years to knowing your grandchildren, and making decisions in that moment where you can capture those 7 generations all at once. And so thinking about very long-term presence, if you like, was really how we started to think about MUŻ. And so for us, there was a couple of things, or for me particularly, there were a couple of things that I wanted to do. The first one was, regardless of how we did it, I wanted to be contributing to Adelaide being a place of learning. And I think that's really critical for us. And the second one was contributing to our young people going through a phase of transformation. That phase that you go through in young adulthood, when you work out who you are and what you want to be and what future you want. And so thinking about this very long-term 100-year, 200-year present really consolidated our thinking about those two aspects. And so, you know, the question when we sort of say, when we want to think about the future, what does that mean? It's always kind of what future, and why are we thinking about that future, and for whom? And so MUŻ is very much centered on, as I said, encouraging young people to take up STEM in their careers, but also more broadly. But we are very much focused on that young adult audience of 15 to 25-year-olds. And as I said, we wanted to be a part of their transformation. And I'm particularly conscious, I guess, of that age group this year, and also younger people as well, because it's been such a change, you know, globally, to what people have traditionally been used to. And obviously COVID is the big change this year, but it's not the only change. We've also got extreme change happening around climate, and, you know, extreme change being, hopefully happening, being prompted around Black Lives Matter, for instance. So it's been a big year of very substantial sort of social shifts. And these are quite complex sort of shifts. And so I just wanted to take you through a model that we use to kind of think about what we need to do to support young people when we bring them into the future. And this is on levels of development, which is there's many many theorists involved, but the one that I'm referring to now is from a paper by Rook and Talbot in Harvard Business Review. And what you're looking at is a section of the US population, people in kind of middle management type roles, if you like. So I acknowledge that it's not very culturally diverse, and it's a slice of the population, but as a model, it's quite useful, because what it says to us is that as we go through a lifetime, we move from the opportunist sort of stage of cognitive development and thinking through to the transpersonal stage over a lifetime. Not everybody goes through all of those stages. Some people will stop at lower stages. But when we're looking at our young audience of 15 to 25-year-olds, you can kind of see that, first of all, most of them are in this kind of section that I've just circled there, between diplomat and expert. And that's that very keen phase where you're moving from shaping your identity based on what your peers have, to expert, which is who am I and what is my own knowledge. And so what we're trying to do at MUŻ is help people shift into that expert phase, and to help them feel like they belong, and they feel like they're secure enough to start to forge their own path. So I think that's a really important part of how we structure our thinking. The other thing is, where I've drawn that line, that line is kind of the transition from thinking about outcomes to being able to understand long-term thinking and complex systems. And most of the challenges that we're experiencing this year, those three that I've just mentioned, COVID, racial inequity, and climate, those are very, very complex systems. But it's really not until we get to that individualist strategist stage that we start to be comfortable in processing ideas around complex systems. So if we're going to have conversations with most of our audience, we have to be able to bring them with us on that journey of having that conversation around complex systems. So again, it's about producing thinking and exhibits that inspire young people, but also make them feel like they belong. So this first thing is really around giving people a sense of belonging. The second thing that I said is we want to inspire them, and this is around navigation. So I often refer to Sohail in Ayatollah's Futures Triangle here, where our young people who come in will come in with their own expectations and beliefs and ideas. There's a whole lot of changes coming their way, and that's technological change, and it's social change, and it's the changes that I've just talked about. And we're trying to navigate them, or we're trying to help them navigate towards their own pull of the future. And so I wanted to just go through those first futures theories about thinking about 200-year presence, and thinking about the way that we structure our thinking and belonging, and thinking about how we might navigate the future, because that very much influences the way that we do everything at MUŞ. And as you'll see, I think that helps us navigate some of the uncertainties as well. And so how we describe ourselves as a place to be and be inspired, and that place to be is about belonging, and the be inspired is about navigating. So to give you an example of some of the things, like a typical exhibit, if you like, you can see we've got two people sitting here in a interactive game in a chair, and what we're actually doing is we're electrocuting them to see how much it hurts. And I'm being quite serious when I say that. We've got a very well-respected group of pain researchers at the university that we're based in, looking at how the brain shapes our perception of pain, and therefore looking for alternative treatments around chronic pain. And so what we've done with our visitors is we've given them this immersive experience of pain. We've shown them how the research might shape treatment options. The exhibit also includes elements around reflecting on that and understanding the science behind that. And so that's sort of a typical, probably we don't often electrocute people, I will say that, but in that moment of being able to showcase the research and helping people understand the science, do it in a way that talks to them in their language, and helps them think about what that future might look like if we're able to find treatments for chronic pain, is really important. And then, as I said, we're part of the University of South Australia. So, that's why, we are wholly funded almost by the university. We do have some partner funding through government and through some of our small to medium businesses, but most of our funding is through the University of South Australia. And so this drive to inspire young adults to continue their education in STEM is also a drive to attract students to the university. And I think it's really interesting to reflect on that, especially around the politics of that, because I think we're in a very unique situation in some ways, in that, you know, we are a free museum, so that the university funds us and is deliberately free. Part of the constitution for the university is to be an accessible university and really bring in people who haven't come from families who've gone to university, so first in family students. And so we are there to be accessible and open and to bring people into the university. But that means that, you know, if the university has been hit hard by the lack of international students because of the COVID disruption, which means that we are facing very difficult funding situation for next year. And in fact, next year we'll be on a third of the funding that we have been previously. And so that's a big shock to the system. And so thinking about how we manage that while still delivering our mission is been one of the things that we've been working on for the last couple of months. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that, because it really is, you know, it's about us being part of the strategy of the university and thinking about the university's vision and being able to fit into that then gives us the longevity. And we are fully part of the university. So what futures, when we talk about, you know, futures, what sort of futures are we actually trying to tackle? And in the last sort of year and a half, you know, from starting with probably We Are Museums, and I know Diane Dubray spoken as part of the series, but thinking about the sorts of things that have come up globally for museums over the last couple of years, I think there's probably 5 things that I'm really conscious about when we're trying to help our young people navigate. So the first one is technology futures, and I guess that's the most obvious. So for South Australia particularly, in this year, the Australian Space Agency was formed. It's now based in Adelaide. South Australia has always had a history of space development, and it is kind of a hub for the development of particularly micro and nano satellites. And so, you know, part of what we want to do is again introduce our young people to this industry that is not just about astronauts, but is about you know, all of those things that space allows us to do with satellites. So looking at, you know, applications for agriculture, applications for weather and climate, and a whole variety of things there. So this is part of an exhibition that showcased all of the satellites that are currently in space and allowed people to see the number of satellites moving around the Earth. Another big push around technology futures is around automation and robotics. And so an exhibition that we're developing for February actually is this exhibit called Custom Made, where some of our engineering students have developed this series of vehicles. So you can see there's a train and a spaceship and a car and a tank. And we're trying to get across the ideas around Industry 4.0. So looking at Internet of Things, looking at customized manufacturing, looking at autonomous driving, unpicking the ethics of all of those things and unpicking the work futures that might sit there as well. So trying to get people to understand, you know, when you say robotics and you think about robots, what does that actually mean for the type of work that we might do? And the other thing that we did this year was part of an exhibit called Life Interrupted. So for Adelaide, the COVID environment has been relatively safe, but in March, everything shut down, like I think it did in many places around the world. And we had a group of about 15 to 20 casual staff. And at that stage, we didn't know how long we were going to be shut down for. And there wasn't any support coming from the government for casual staff of the university. And so we were very keen to make sure that for our business continuity and because of our you know, values in our people, that we were able to switch them from being front of house gallery attendants to having work while we were closed. And so we developed this online exhibition called Life Interrupted. And that ran for 4 or 5 months, where we had a variety of exhibits online, but we also had our moderators, our casual staff facilitating activities for people online. But some of the things that we were doing were around showcasing artificial intelligence. So this comes from an exhibit, one of our online exhibits, which is really looking at machine learning and artificial intelligence and giving our audience a chance to kind of play with some of those things and see how they work. So that's technology futures. But I guess I did want to sort of say, so far you can see that when we've talked about technology futures, we've covered something which is quite, you know, something that's come through the medium of touch screens, something that is going to literally be robots racing around a racetrack, and then something that has a digital interface. So there's quite a few different modes of engagement that we're using here already. The next one is obviously climate focus, and I think it's really important that you know, climate is the big one, and it can feel very overwhelming. And so how do we not take our eye off the ball when it comes to climate, when everything else is kind of coming at us? So this is sort of something that we've been thinking about throughout each of our exhibitions. In an exhibition called Hedonism last year, we worked with the New York-based artist Annie Liu to produce this installation called Biophilic Fantasies, which was thinking about how you might get health benefits from nature if you were living on Mars. Half of those plants are real and half of those were fake, and watching people interact with them and kind of understand what made them, how they were interacting, and the discussions that came from that were quite interesting, but prompted a lot of conversations then around climate and how much we can manipulate and alter nature in times of extreme climate. Another thing that's coming up for the exhibition next year is a review upon octopus ecologies, and so we've run an interactive game which is kind of inspired by Tamagotchis, but essentially you're able to interact with the octopus, and by changing its environment, you can see what's required for the octopus to survive. And again, when we think about the impact of climate on our oceans, bringing that to the fore, but doing it through a way that's not simply about climate, I think is really helpful. And then again, when I think about our online exhibition, Life Interrupted, for 4 days a week, 3 hours a day, we had our casual staff in Minecraft. And one of the activities they were doing in Minecraft was rebuilding a world after the apocalypse. And again, that prompted a whole lot of interesting conversations around what kind of world we are creating, and what kind of world we want to create, and what does that look like in the face of climate. So by the end of that exhibit, we had a couple of hundred people on a Discord channel talking about science and climate. And I think while that might be quite niche and not thousands and thousands of people, to get 200 people really engaged online was very exciting for us. The third thing I wanted to talk about then was social contract. And I think this is, you know, particularly sharp when we think about some of the tribalism and the political separation that we've seen through the US elections this year. But as we all know, it's not confined to the US, and the separation that we're feeling, I think, is quite useful to talk about and give people tools to think about how they try and bridge some of those gaps. So for Waging Peace, we did an exhibit with UK-based artist Superflux, where we looked at some of the tribes, if you like, that were forming on the internet. And it's kind of really difficult to look at this film now. We produced a film called Trigger Warning, which is still available on our website, looking at those increasingly, you know, discordant and violent commentary around being very non-inclusive. And so, you know, getting that to again provoke conversations about people and getting people to think about how to bridge that, or being aware of it at least, and certainly being aware of the risk of falling into kind of conspiracy theories and making that much realer than it is. And I think that's a really interesting point for museums to think about as agents of trust, and often agents of you know, good solid research and scientific method is how we have those conversations and how we help people see some of those realities that become much more difficult when we're in very tight online groups. The other thing that we're conscious about for our young audience, obviously, is it's a time where you're entering your first relationships, and issues of, I guess, consent and sexual assault are so vivid for that group. And we wanted to make sure that we were doing something that again gave people tools to have conversations around this. And so we worked with a local firm called Monkey Stack to create an app and this physical build of an exhibit, which is all about consent. And so in here, the game is about helping a spaceship write itself, but in order to do that, you have to form a consensual relationship with the artificial intelligence on the spaceship. The metaphors are fairly obvious, I must say. We're currently developing this. This year, we've developed this installation into a standalone app that was going to be used for for students coming into the university to teach them about consent and respectful relationships as part of that journey into becoming adults. So again, something kind of thinking about that social contract we have with each other and giving people some tools to scaffold difficult conversations. The fourth thing that we've seen, and I think this runs perhaps, well, you know, it runs very closely to thinking about Black Lives Matter, but for us in Australia particularly, it's around thinking about decolonisation and decolonising museums, and thinking about how we work with and in service of First Nations people. So as I said at the beginning, you know, we're very conscious that we're on Kaurna land. We don't have a collection. We're not a collecting institution where we build immersive experiences. But how do we do that in a way that doesn't just privilege Western ideas? How do we bring in Aboriginal and First Nations knowledge into the space and give it its own voice? And how do we do that in a way that's working with those communities and not, and engaging them in the design as best as we can? So one of the things that we've done is work with a senior custodian for the Kaurna people, Carl Telfer, on bringing the Kaurna seasons into relief for people. So there are 6 or 8 different Kaurna seasons that you know, maybe broadly track against some of the European seasons, but they are different. This is the season of Waltadi, which is the hot season of fire, where we've just sort of coming out of the season of Waludi, which is the spring season where everything flowers. And so giving people the language of talking about these seasons and seeing what happens is really important. And again, you know, for us at the start of the year when there were, you know, very severe bushfires across Australia and including South Australia, people would come into the gallery and they would see this, and there will be conversations around the land management of Aboriginal people to manage fire and to manage burns. And it was a community, you know, that it was at that stage of the year, it was people came in with real concern and real concern for community because lives had been lost through those bushfires, and the future does feel very uncertain. You know, we've just come off 2 days of 40-degree heat again, and you know, thinking about how to do this differently and how to use First Nations knowledge to rethink our relationship with land is really, really important. Not just to make up for the you know, the mistakes of the past, but also to put us in a better position for the future. And the other thing that we've done is work with several Aboriginal people to tell stories of the stars. So we have this beautiful room that you saw earlier talking about satellites that we can use to talk about space. This is Caroline Johnson sharing stories around some of the stars and some of those stories. And again, privileging Aboriginal knowledge as being critical for our understanding of how the world works. And I guess, so those things I think have been with us for a while, obviously, thinking about decolonising, thinking about racial equity, thinking about our social contract and the way that we relate, and especially around conflict, thinking about climate and thinking about digital futures. I don't think none of those are new, but I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of them either, because they are continuing to put pressure on the way that we do things, and we have to adapt. And then, of course, this year has mostly, since certainly for us here since March, been about COVID-19 and thinking about what that means. And there are obviously some short-term futures. So I said, you know, for us, the lack of international students coming into the university means that the university isn't able to provide as much funding as they otherwise would, and we have to rethink what we do. That's a fairly short-term future, though. And so, and again, some of the things around closures may be short-term, but some of these are long-term. So we will see institutions over this period close and not reopen. So what kind of institutions might replace them, I think, is a really important question to be thinking about. And then I'm also thinking about what are the other things that COVID has really thrown up in terms of our ability to take on new skills or adapt. So one of the first things I think is certainly, I mean, I'm sure it's for everybody, the increase in community literacy around exponential graphs and looking at numbers and looking at stats has obviously become very, you know, very everyday for everybody. This view is of a room in our recent exhibition, Seven Siblings of the Future, which we did in partnership with the Hedonism Science Centre. What we did is while after we were closed and we did our digital exhibition, when we came back, we installed this timeline of telemedicine. And the third bottom one sort of says, managing telehealth around COVID, and worked with our researchers to anticipate, how that might happen. So it's around, really trying to bring that conversation around visualizing this change into the exhibition. But I think that skill around community literacy around science and around health is becoming, even more important as we head into the potential of vaccines in the new year. And the other big thing that I think emerges is all around remote and digital work. So again, as part of our Life Interrupted exhibition, when we were all working from home, and one of the things that we did was produce 64 hours of TV. So over 16 weeks, we produced 4 hours of TV a week. And we did that through interviews. We did meditation and wellbeing classes. A couple of our casual staff created this game called Museum Shift, which is a role-playing game where you can pretend that you are in a museum. And we also sort of did live streaming of games. But I think there's a couple of things that I would reflect on that. So one is around just being so adaptable, because obviously that's not in the general skill set of somebody who's on the floor of a gallery having conversations with people. There are digital skills, there are presenting skills, there's gaming and design skills that all came into doing that. And I think that's a broad community conversation at the moment, is about how people are adapting to do remote and digital work, and just what that looks like. So those would be the key things that I think are coming up, particularly around COVID. But I haven't mentioned, I've touched on it a bit, but I haven't mentioned the economic impacts that we're likely to see, and haven't mentioned really around the mental health kind of impacts that we're already starting to see and are likely to continue, and aggravated by that. And so how we aggravated by the economic impact. So how we bring that into our conversations, I think, with our audience is really important. In reflecting on all of those, though, and thinking about how we're responding to climate, and we're trying to drive active responses, and think about engaging our community in that, or how we're trying to actively engage in First Nations thinking, or how we're trying to skill up our community in thinking about remote and digital work. All of that, I would say, are preferred futures. It's what we think we should be doing. It's what we want to be doing. It's the change that we want to see. And so a lot of the conversations that I've had across the last year or so in museums have been, these are the things we think we need to do to change what the museum is. And so I'm sure there are some people listening who will be saying, that's not my preferred vision for the future. I have a different vision. And I think that's yes, people do. And so while some of us might share these agendas and these things that we would like to see, then they're not universal. And they're not necessarily what is likely to happen either. Some of the challenges about really decolonizing institutions are really, really difficult, and might not be achievable as much as we hope. Some of the challenges around climate and the role of the museum in that are really, really challenging. And so to kind of grapple with this idea around how do we think about these futures, I wanted to just touch on a model called the Futures Cone, and I kind of go back to Joseph Forrest's right up here, but there's a whole body of work around the Futures Cone. So I think those futures that I've just talked about being adaptable to remote and digital, about thinking about automation, about managing climate, all of those things. These are preferred futures, and they sit probably somewhat off what is likely, because that's why we do the work we do. And I think Diane Drewbray's talk, she said, what we're seeking is change. It's not necessarily a future necessarily, but we're seeking to change things, to make things better. And it's the change to the better future that we're really looking for here. And that's kind of the gap, I suppose, between the probable and the preferable. But I think one of the things that COVID has thrown up this year is that the probable isn't predictable. And we shouldn't rely on thinking that we know what is going to happen. And in fact, the Futures Cone gives us a plethora of other alternative futures. So we have a range of plausible scenarios of things that, might happen, and we have possible futures that could happen, and we have preposterous futures that will probably never happen. But I think what we've seen this year with some of the COVID things is those probably never happened, futures have happened. And so, you know, I think about some of the things that have happened here in terms of shutting down the economy or providing welfare support for people to get through shutdown. Those things were never possible. And so this year has moved our window, I think, around what is preposterous and what is probable, and being able to, you know, prepare for, I guess, a whole range of futures does give us more tools to work with our communities. So I wanted just to touch on what about other plausible futures? You know, what else might be there? And to do this, I've been drawing on a series of scenarios developed by a group called the Special Circumstances Intelligence Unit. And they developed a series of scenarios called the Grey Briefing scenarios in April this year. And I think they're all still really relevant to kind of provoke us to think about what is the role of, well, for me, what is the role of MUŻ, but what is the role of, you know, any museum under other plausible futures, things we might not have managed. And so these scenarios, you know, start off on the assumption that COVID's amplified 4 major pre-existing challenges. Unstable work is one of those. And so, you know, the gig economy and casualisation of the workforce has put millions at risk. That there's been a hardening of borders, attitudes and policies where populist nationalism has taken hold. And I mentioned that when I was speaking about the social contract and increasing tribalism. That we're in the middle of an epidemic of depression, anxiety and mental illness. And I touched on that briefly as well. And that we are also subject to pervasive digital surveillance. So when we're thinking about those technology futures, one of the ones that I hadn't really talked about much in Internet of Things is just the surveillance that we are under all of the time, but also COVID gives permission for increasing surveillance when we're looking at contract tracing. And so all of those things mean that basically they require, all scenarios have widespread unemployment, which we're just starting to see here in Australia. It requires profound intervention from the state to manage, and then how that is managed determines what happens next. So in one scenario, which we've called the pyramid, government responds by enacting policies that benefit the few, resulting in economic concentration and inequality. And so, you know, Trump's America was probably a really good example of where we were sitting here. So millions of people are left angry, frustrated and exposed, poverty and violence increase, governments respond with more extreme measures, and which is administered through military power and advanced digital surveillance tools. So, you know, a violent future where inequality spreads. And I think if we think about what this looks like for museums, there's some really critical questions. I mean, what does it look like for women in this? What does it look like for international connections? How do you access or protect collections when you've got a government that perhaps doesn't really care? And I'm reflecting on a couple of conversations earlier in the year that I had with colleagues in Colombia and in Brazil, where the community needs were different. So instead of coming into the museum necessarily, the museum was going out and making sure people had basic supplies, because it was tricky to do that. So I think what is the purpose of the museum may change very drastically under pyramid scenario, where the funding isn't there, where the funding and the value of the institution is not there. A second possible scenario is the Leviathan. And so here, governments rapidly and dramatically expand their powers, but they use it to deliver collective benefits and goals. So thinking about how China might deliver on climate through clean technologies is perhaps a good example. But here we're seeing a range of investments in renewable technologies and in public infrastructure like roads, and that would be another example. So everyone's mobilised to help with these solutions, creating a flourishing of bottom-up experiments with active support, which lays the foundation for post-crisis recovery. And it pays off, but if you don't agree with the direction, then you may be marginalised. And so there's I guess, a risk here of dissent. So I think, in this scenario, perhaps international collaboration becomes much easier. And perhaps there is room to really shift the dial on climate change. You can see for in this scenario, for the sort of work that we do at MUŻ, there's a real benefit into pushing people into science and technology, because that's where the investment might be. But you would also have to worry about arts and the role of arts in an environment like this, and the role of dissent. And the third scenario is the village, where state intervention is very ineffective. The economy contracts, support services disappear, and people are forced to rely on each other. There's grey market workarounds and creating dependence on precarious small-scale networks. So communities are more sustainable and more self-reliant, but they're also more fragile. And the world becomes more fragmented, volatile, and tribal. So in this scenario, it's really difficult to see how museums might do things at scale. I think you could have further interruptions in supply chains. How do museums continue to work across community boundaries, or do they become much more focused on serving the needs of the community? I think is a really interesting point. So when I'm thinking about, kind of responding to what might happen in the next couple of years, I'm thinking about how do we continue to meet the needs of young people, for instance? What is our role in a village scenario where we might have even less and less funding? How do we still do good work if we can't do it by putting on immersive exhibitions? In a Leviathan situation, how can we still do what's important to us, which is about looking at those interdisciplinary skills of art and science, and not just privilege one? And I think, going back to that diagram, which has that room of plausible futures, thinking about our preferred futures in that bigger context is really important. And here we end up then kind of understanding where the room for change is, because it's not just the change from the probable to the preferred. We've got a room from a range of scenarios now that we might need to think about in terms of how we craft the preferred. And some of our preferred futures might not have been things that we were thinking about. And it might be moving into different types of services and different types of delivery methods, which many of us have done this year, because I think COVID was not one of those probable futures, although it was plausible and it was not completely unexpected. But I think the impact of it has been just so vivid for people that it creates a new opportunity to see our preferred futures anew. But it's also tiring, so I think about the changes that we've done this year, and thinking about, a real push on climate at the start of the year, being very conscious in the wake of the bushfires that we're running out of time, moving on to a very, we did that life interrupted exhibition in 8 days. That was the lead up and the delivery time to get us online and to preserve work for people and to stay connected with our community. Coming back to then delivering things in a COVID constrained world with a whole bunch of different regulations, and then managing now what is a very severe change to our financial position, so that we can still deliver that work. And so, the key question that I had when I spoke to Sandro about this was given that future focus, and given the amount of change that is likely to happen, and that will continue to happen based on what has happened this year, how do we generate resilience? And so I just wanted to think about this in light of what we've done. And the way that I think about resilience is resilience comes from being impacted by disruption, and then us moving to add protective factors to bounce back. And as I said, I think for lots of museums, that bounce back is really difficult. And if we can't really anticipate the disruption, it's hard to put plans into do that. So how do we then focus on the protective factors? And for individuals, I think there are a range of protective factors that we can do. As leaders of institutions, we probably want to do this on an individual basis, but I think there are also organizational things as well. So one of the protective factors is to build connections. And so I would say that, what you're doing in this seminar series, for instance, but also the We Are Museums network and those Excite Science Centre European networks online, and for myself also a network of futurists, have been the thing that has really helped me sustain resilience this year, because there are global connections with people undergoing similar things, and I don't have to do it all by myself. So I think continuing to build global connections is critical. Need to nurture wellness. And so for the individual, this means being mindful of energy, but I think it's the same as for the organisation. So for my organisation, it's been a really difficult year, and we're losing half of the team. So how do you make sure that you're not doing so much that everybody is exhausted? How do you give people enough surge capacity in the system? And so it might mean that when the disruption is very big and it's frequent, that we need to do less. in order for us to be able to still keep bouncing back, or we need to maybe build in some redundancies into the system to allow us to have more surge capacity. How do we keep with that purpose? So for us, moving digital was very clear, because it was about a place to be and be inspired, and we knew that we were working for young adults and we wanted to keep doing that. And it didn't really matter how we did it, because the purpose was clear. But I think the purpose has to be more than the exhibits, or more than the collection, or more than the what of what we do. It has to be for whom and for why that we bring it. It has to be elevated. Otherwise, again, those things are otherwise easily knocked out from underneath us. And the last one is being able to adopt a mindset of resilience, not necessarily being an unsurvivable trauma, but something that also allows us to thrive and to grow. So I've been thinking a lot about the difference between resilience, this ability to bounce back or even to bounce forward when hit by a disruption, and the idea around hope. And so hope theory says that for us to have hope, we need to have a positive, engaging image of the future, a vision that pulls us forward. We need to have agency so we feel like we can make a difference, and we need to have multiple pathways to get there. And so I think we need both resilience and hope. I think resilience helps us bounce back. We have those protective factors in it. But if we're not also feeling like we have the mindset of hope, where we have those visions, agency and pathways, it's not easy to move, to adapt to, you know, that complex series of emerging futures that I've talked about. And I've found hope to be quite sustaining, to feel like regardless, there is always that purpose that brings us forward, that even if we can make a small difference, we can still make a difference, and that there are different options. And I think being able to generate hope is just a really critical thing that we need to do for ourselves, for our teams, and for our communities, especially when the future is rocking us about. So I wanted to finish by just introducing a final exhibit, which is going into the It's Complicated exhibition opening in February. I love the fact that this exhibition has been in the planning for over 2 years now, and it keeps getting delayed. And the fact that we've called it It's Complicated in such a complicated environment, I think is perfect. But what you're looking at now is the path made by a double pendulum, which is if you have two swinging pendulums, slight changes to the initial position will cause really different patterns, and it's impossible to predict. And so the message I think there from that is that complex systems are, you know, they are complex. They co-evolve. They are non-linear. They have feedback systems in them. They are self-organizing. Complex systems are emergent. They're adaptable, and they're networked. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do as museums when we respond to the challenges of all of these futures, so that we're prepared to both thrive and also be helpful. Thank you very much.
Mike.
Hey, Kristin. This is Mike here. Thank you so much. That was such a fantastic presentation, and I really appreciate bringing in these ideas of hope into this moment that we're all experiencing right now. I think it's so important, and especially I appreciate you being honest and kind of vulnerable about the position that you're in, being sort of in a leadership position at an institution and being faced with having to be in a new financial reality, having to cut the team, having to rethink things, yet at the same time thinking about what that means for growth. One of the things, so you hit on so many things that I've been thinking about in terms of resilience, which is amazing, which is fantastic. And one of the things that you touched upon that I'll sort of ask for you to talk a little more about, although maybe because it's in the middle of the night, my brain isn't going to be able to ask the questions perfectly. But this one idea that you talked about, you said bouncing forward instead of just bouncing back. And I wrote that down and circled it like 5 or 6 times, because I think what we're seeing, and maybe this is a little bit more of a US museum perspective, but but I have a feeling it's happening in a lot of museums all over the world, is this tendency right now to want to bounce back, which has the sense of comfort. It has a sense of like, you know, when are we going to get back to blockbuster exhibitions, galleries filled with people, huge education programs, schools visiting, you know, lining up outside our doors and all that. And the reason why I like this idea of bouncing forward so much is because it is so much about what you're talking about, which is this idea of, as difficult as it might seem at a moment like this with so much, you know, grief and so much trauma happening, that this could be a moment of growth and of pushing us to thrive in different ways. So I'd love to you know, hear you speak a little bit about that idea a little bit more, about bouncing forward, and especially for museums that, I mean, you're at an institution that is just really experimental and taking tons of risks. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're in the pandemic or not. And those institutions definitely exist out there. And I think they've got leaders like you that are sort of leaning as best they can in the complex situation towards, you know, how can we take advantage of this moment and rethink the future of museums, but also of our own institution. But what about the vast majority of institutions out there that might be leaning more towards that bouncing back? I mean, what is this conversation that we need to be having as we get through the next 1 to 2 years, and certainly beyond, to get museums to maybe rethink themselves, to align with a lot of these ideas that I think you're so rightfully bringing forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting, and I will, you know, I say I'm not a therapist, so I'm not going to try and summarize the psychological literature about resilience, but my background in resilience comes from thinking about community resilience to climate change, and doing some work several years ago now with the Port Adelaide community here. And what we were looking at was then looking at some of those models of what happens when individuals are hit by a trauma. And, you know, for some people that is debilitating, and it really knocks them out. But for some people, it strengthens them. It's like the testing of the steel, if you like, that actually makes them stronger, and coping with that trauma or coping with that challenge gives them a whole new skill set and a range of things that they can do that's beyond what they would have otherwise done on the trajectory that they had been before the disruption. So I think that's really interesting, because often we have a mindset that if you're hit by a challenge, you know, you've got to get back off the floor and get ready for the next kind of thing. But it is like we're overwhelmed. And I think that what we've talked about in terms of that epidemic, if you like, of mental ill health, and feeling like everything is kind of an attack on our mental well-being, all of those things I think are really valid. But knowing that there is also this opportunity to be strengthened by those challenges, and to thrive, and to have learned a whole lot of new skill sets so that you are actually in a really good position for when the next challenge comes along, I think is really, really important. And I think, as I said, some of it is mindset. And I love the way that you were talking, because all I could keep thinking was, we've got to get back to normal. But, you know, what I was trying to show with those futures cones is the normal has probably shifted. You know, the normal has shifted. And so you have a range of people trying to get back to a normal that's no longer there. And that's where I think we want to kind of take that complex systems approach and say, where can we adapt? Where can we evolve? What does the new normal then look like for us? And how do we make the most of that? So, I mean, one of the conversations we're having at the moment is, we can't. I mean, and I will also say, look, we're in a very privileged position in Australia, because there are very low rates of COVID here. And so many of and up until like last week, we hadn't had a community transmission for months and months and months. And so our operations were almost back to normal. But, you know, we get hit by it again this week, and we've got to go, okay, what does the new normal look like? And how do we keep doing what we do if we can't have thousands and thousands of people coming through the door? What is the new hybrid digital model? What are the new outreach models? What are the new models of co-design that we do with people? And look, it's really tough. It is tough, because these are not simple kind of challenges. But I think, I guess what I've been asking and what I mean, if the advice is helpful, it's taking that learning mindset to the moment and trying to then anticipate what might be different rather than just trying to get back to the new normal. So, and being prepared, I mean, and if you've got that really strong purpose or vision, that is easier, because then the vision isn't about opening the doors and getting 1,000 people through. The vision is about affecting the community to do X or helping the community to see X, and then your options are open. So when we were talking about resilience, I said, you know, we're looking at the resilience of a community to respond to climate change. It was about sort of understanding what are the skills and attributes they would need to be able to adapt and mitigate climate change in the future, and how could they respond in a way that would then make them stronger. So we want people to come out of this tested and stronger, I think is the key.
Yeah. I mean, along those lines, there was this, it was something that I was reading. I can't remember, it was a couple months ago, this idea of like post-traumatic growth, that, and the interesting thing that I found in it wasn't that every time that a group or an individual experiences something traumatic or, you know, challenging or difficult, that there is a moment of growth, but there are certain ways that we can respond to that that can get us into that growth moment. And I haven't had tons of time to think about that or have conversations about that with a lot of, you know, people working in museums right now, but I think it's such a key part of this conversation around like how we sort of evolve. Because that bouncing back, I mean, I just know that a lot of the conversations that I've been a part of, people are worried about the bouncing back, because if you have budget cuts and staff cuts, but you're envisioning going back to normal, you're going to burn out your staff, and it isn't.
Yeah, that's why I think that's resilient stuff around. You know, if you want to bounce forward, you need more elasticity. You know, you need more energy. You need more power to be able to bounce forward than just to bounce to where you were. So I think it's useful to think about then how you build energy into the organization when people have been hit with a challenge. And so I've been on this very much. We're not doing that anymore. We're not doing that anymore. We're not doing that anymore. I don't have a person who can do that. And we're all kind of like, but we think we could, you know, we're creative, smart people. We think we could do all of those things. And I'm trying to keep saying, no, we don't do those now, because we have to build energy in order to be able to do the right thing at the right time. And so some of that stuff has to stop. So, you know, we're stopping all of our programming. We're stopping all of our marketing. We're stopping all of our events and all of our corporate hires and a whole lot of things that we just wouldn't have energy to deliver to our young adult audience if we tried to do all of that stuff as well. And so, you know, it's really hard and it's really frustrating, but it is being able to re-energize and take care of people in a way that is then going to allow them to have the energy to do something different. Because if you're really if you're exhausted, then it's really hard to think creatively as well. And so, you know, the options open to you in an exhausted kind of pattern are really what you know. And what we're asking of people when we're asking to bounce forward is to move beyond that and anticipate something new. And you have to be creative to do that. You have to be well rested to be creative, I think.
Well, that kind of leads to the last thing that I want to ask, and then I want to make sure we can, you know, get some of the questions coming in from the chat. But I know Carmel and Sandro always have awesome questions to chime in here too. I'm really curious about. I'm so glad that you mentioned, you know, sort of one of these factors of nurturing wellness within museums, and I think this idea of care within institutions is something that I think is so important right now, in addition to, you know, institutions providing care for, you know, sort of their broader communities. What are some ways that, and you kind of started talking about that a little bit by sort of saying no to certain things, but what are some other ways that you, or that you've heard other museums being able to really bring that ideas of wellness and care into museum institutions that might be something we can sort of bounce forward to and hold on to as we get out of the urgent need for that and get into how do we bring that, what can we bring into sort of a more permanent museum mindset around wellness and care?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I think that it's interesting to reflect on what we did. So, I mean, as I said, the the impetus for us doing an online exhibition was that to preserve employment for casual staff before, you know, like while there was no message on funding change, how do we make sure that those people are doing something useful, and so their employment is of value, you know, and that did send a signal to all of us that we cared about people, and that we cared about what people were doing, given it was such an unusual situation. And we were able to retain, you know, a good 3/4 of that casual staff team throughout the year. The second thing that we did was the Life Interrupted exhibition, the digital one we did on connection and well-being in a disrupted world, because those seemed to be the conversations that we were having. And so every Wednesday we either had a meditation session or a yoga session online through our MUŻ TV. And I thought that was good, but I hadn't realized how many of my team were tuning into that, because it was really helpful. And so, you know, that's kind of the almost the classic, you know, how do you get people to take care of themselves? And we know the value of meditation, we know the value of stretching or yoga or regular exercise or all of those sorts of things. And if you're stuck in a lockdown situation, you know, connection and social well-being is also really important. But that's not why we did it. We did it because we thought the audience needed, but it had a really, really great benefit for staff as well. I keep seeing a comic go round. I mean, obviously university sectors are under stress. I keep seeing a comic go round where, you know, the university management says, you should look after your well-being. And the person says, but my workload's too high. And they say, go and meditate. Here's more work, you know. And I think, you know, that's the principle of saying no to some things to make sure that people do have a reasonable workload. And I think the other thing is the stuff that we've talked about with, well, I touched on a little bit with decolonization, but also with our purpose about belonging is just that inclusivity, you know, so making sure that people have somewhere safe to be, and that the way they identify is valued, is really important, I think. And so we've been quite conscious about thinking about inclusion for young people, kind of understanding that young people are experiencing lots of fluidity about sexual identity, or gender identity, that they're experiencing lots of fluidity in terms of, you know, job expectations and the types of things, you know, like you might sort of say, oh, you know, in year 12, you might say, this is what I'm going to do when I grow up, but those sorts of things aren't as solid. So that becomes, you know, tricky for identity as well, I think. If your identity was about playing community sport and your sport has been cancelled all year, that's a challenge to identity. If you're a young Black person or an Aboriginal person or any person of colour, then the tribalism and the increased racism of stress is really pointed, I think, this year. So trying to be really, really conscious of belonging for not just our audience, but also for our staff. And making sure that they feel like it's a safe place to work, I think, is one of those other aspects that, you know, often we're thinking about that for the audience, but for our team and for the people who work with us, it's really critical. And for us, having an identity around not being afraid to take risks and not being afraid to think about change, and that's kind of how we were built. But that sort of series of values, I think, has been really important because people have really taken that on board as well. So you know, I think well-being is around that self-care aspect, but we've also got to, as I said, we've also got to think organisationally. You know, so what are the slowdown points for the organisation? How does the organisation meditate? How does it give it space to think? I think is really important. So, you know, I think I've just summarised. I think it is around, you know, those understanding of mental health and well-being for your team. It's also about inclusion and identity and having a safe place to work. It's also about workload, and it's about that social connection and making sure that people do have a community around them when it's not so easy to do that. Yeah.
Well, if people don't take anything else away, I think the idea that an organization needs to meditate is pretty fantastic. I really love that idea now more than any other time. So
yeah, and for us, we've tried to do that by having quarterly field trips. You know, so once a quarter we would we would go out and we would do something that isn't related to the exhibition or the program or the, you know, or the finances or anything. And we'd go and explore what other people were doing, and try deliberately not to use that stuff, right? That wasn't a research trip. That was to put into the bag so that in 2 years' time, we could pull something new out and go, oh, remember when we saw, you know, remember when we went to the cosmetic farm and we saw all of the herbs and the flowers they were producing? And do you remember that bright, vivid orange color of the chrysanthemums? Let's do something with that. But it's not applicable straight away. And so for this year, when we haven't been able to do those field trips, we've done sort of set days where we've asked people to, you know, walk around the neighborhood, notice things, you know, try and fill that bag of creative thinking in a way that is there for later. So I guess that's our version of organizational meditation, but I'm really curious to see what other people come up with, because I'd love to do a bit more. Now you've got me thinking more about that.
Fantastic. Kristin, thank you for such an inspiring presentation. I mean, there are so many questions that I'm sure will be going beyond time, but we cannot do that. I'll leave mine for later, but I'd like to take some of the questions that are coming up on the chat. And I think I can summarize 2 questions in one here, which is about the future role of museums. There's a question by Trish Hansen, who's asking about how museums, what would be the role of museums in the next 10 years to lead large-scale, deep, and quality public discourse. There's another question coming from someone who has labeled himself Blues, and who is also asking you to say a little bit more about this 7th generation perspective and how it can inform museum post-COVID-19 futures. What would be your take on that?
Yeah, so I might start about 7 generations first, and then I might sort of tackle the role of museums in 10 years. But so I mean, I think it's interesting that it's, you know, it's probably, you know, 3-4 generations ago that we last had a pandemic, and to some extent we're relearning all of that stuff from scratch. So I mean, I'm conscious about that because my grandmother lost her sister with Spanish flu in like 1916 or something. So 1919. So I find it really interesting that all of the things that we see that were, you know, risks and challenges to marginalized communities are the same. That, you know, some of the basic practices to prevent it are social distancing and wearing masks, and all of those things we almost should have learned. You know, we should have been prepared for. So I think, and I think the other thing is that, you know, some of the stuff around the cause of pandemics is exacerbated by our increasingly urban living environments and our increasing encroachment on wilder areas. And so you would expect this to sort of come up again and again and again, and for this not to be a really, you know, unusual sort of circumstance. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is just how do we improve the ability of us to respond and manage this quickly, and then kind of, you know, move into how do we shift our operating systems, I suppose, towards, you know, a pandemic situation and then a non-pandemic situation, and how do we do that very quickly? Because that seems to be the driver that is going to help us get out of the very severe impacts of that. And so if I'm thinking about you know, that 7 generation futures, what kind of things might we need for our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren to be able to shift and to make adjustments, and some of that's going to be storytelling, right? And that's what museums are so great at, is being able to not just kind of explain what you need to do, but tell the stories and show how people have shifted and show how that has worked. So I think there's sort of storytelling around this that's really important. You know, I think the other thing that so for the post-COVID futures is just, I mean, I'm curious to think about, for so many people, the impact of this has been very traumatic. People have lost loved ones. We've talked about the economic downturn and the loss of jobs. We've talked about the impact on mental health, and that stuff does echo through generations. And so again, part of that 7 generation kind of aspect is thinking about those epigenetic impacts, if you like, and then kind of asking what do we need to do to help people thrive, and to help people kind of do that bounce forward that we've been talking about. So for me, I guess the other thing I keep coming back to with 7 generations is just, I mean, when we're thinking about climate, just the conversations I've had with so many young people over this year who are not thinking about being parents at all because they don't want to risk bringing people into a world that's not getting better. And so I think, you know, you need to bring that 7th generation into the current thinking, or we're too slow. We're too slow. So some of it, I think, is around increasing our speed of being able to adapt to a new way of thinking, and shifting off speed of development and speed of progress, and shifting towards, you know, a speed of care and a speed of connection. So those are sorts of the things that when I'm thinking about 7 generations, I'm thinking about how do we not wait for that to evolve? How do we bring some of those things forward? And how do we do that by telling really good stories and giving people tools to be able to respond faster than we have? And then I think if we think about the role of museums in the next 10 years, I mean, I think it really depends on those scenarios that I painted. You know, in a scenario like the village or like the pyramid, the museum might become a core community centre for fundamental provision of services in some ways. If we're thinking about the Leviathan, the museum might have a role in telling those very grand stories and motivating people towards a collective change. So I think we need to be mindful about the context that we're working in, and what our communities need. That needs us to kind of get out of our own heads. You know, and I think, you know, then you've got this tension about really good co-design with the community, but also you've got a tension in something like the pyramid scenario, where you've got high degrees of tribalism, and probably, you know, what we're seeing is a willingness to believe in easy answers and conspiracy theories. Then the role of the museum has to be maybe at odds with the community in some way. It has to tell a different story. So, I mean, generally, I'm a big fan of museum spaces to have conversations, and there aren't a lot of places for public discourse, if you like. I don't think the political environment is necessarily the best way for that to happen. So I think museums being the centre of a place where people come and have good conversations, and they tell stories, they listen to stories, they unpack stories, they critique stories, they, you know, and that's why I'm less concerned about the conversation around whether it's a collection based or whether it's a living museum or whether it's an immersive museum like us, because I think that kind of connection to conversation around stories is the most important thing.
Really interesting, and I think that this idea of the museum becoming a community space, but also going beyond the stereotypical idea of a museum, is something that is being discussed in other quarters. So I can see your idea as one of a possible future, of one of the possible futures. My second question is a bit more practical. I did get to see Life Interrupted, the online exhibition, and that was amazing. I didn't know that it was a project which was put together in 8 days. So I can only imagine the stress and the pressure to handle that. So I think resilience was very much present. My question would be, because this is something which came up even in the discussion in March and April, when there was a lot of stuff being produced, and some of the stuff was being rehashed or reproposed, and museums were putting stuff online, and quality was being questioned. I mean, how did you manage to be resilient in these circumstances, just having 8 days, and getting the quality that you wanted for your project? Yeah,
that's such a good question. And I'll say the to contrast that, so I mean, if you look at the normal path of pandemics, you'd expect a second wave. Obviously, most countries have had this sort of second wave come through. And so after we sort of got Life Interrupted up and running, I then gave the task to a couple of my team members to develop a second online exhibition that we could have in reserve for managing another time when we might have to go offline. And we've had 6 months to prepare that one, right? So contrasting those two, I think, has been a really interesting exercise for us. And we've learned a lot about what the best online exhibitions might look like, for instance, or where we get the most satisfaction. So for us, it was a willingness to look a bit stupid, you know, and we thought if there's something up there and it's not quite right, we can take it down. You know, so one of the stupidest things we did was just a gallery of staff members' pets to make people feel happy, and it ended up being the most popular thing on that exhibition. But I was like, we'll just do that to fill a space, and then we'll take it down. So I think some of it is that willingness to do things that are quite silly and not particularly serious. The other thing that we did was we identified a series of things that we could do, but we couldn't do just yet. So we started with a collection of things, and then we commissioned some things that then evolved kind of as we went through. So there were some beautiful pieces that we were able to commission, some beautiful sound pieces and some beautiful dance pieces that came online, and we were able to have discussions. So there was also this, you know, the stuff that we were able to do very quickly, we were able to then augment with some things that were slower and higher quality, I suppose, as we went through. And then we were looking at adapting some of the things that had been in exhibits to online versions. And so we've spent the year, you know, adapting our compliment booth, where you press a button and you get a compliment, which is also very popular when people are home alone. Adapting a measure of Twitter happiness, and also we're just about to launch our adaptation of the Seven Siblings exhibition as an online version, so you can go through and have that sort of similar experience but online. So I think in that in some ways answer it. We got a lot of things up very quickly. Which meant that we could, and we weren't afraid of doing silly things in the start, but we were able to augment that with some things that were, I guess, more thoughtful and had a higher quality as we went through. And the other thing that we did was with Mod TV. So that was like, had so many conversations, I suppose, when we're thinking about automation, which is how do you make sure that people are in that conversation about automation, you know, and the relationship between humans and robots is so important. And so I thought when we're going online, what I wanted to see was that we won't only giving it to the digital, and that we had humans in those conversations. And so Mod TV and live streaming games and playing role-playing games and doing Minecraft, you know, facilitated by our casual staff in a one-to-one, you know, relationship with visitors as they would be having in the galleries was a really critical part of that, and allowed us to play. And then the quality is not just the exhibit or just the thing. The quality is people participating and interacting and engaging and having conversations again. So again, it's slightly different to maybe just immersing yourself in a digital view of something, whether, you know, a poor quality experience really matters if it's just you on your own. But when you're having a conversation with someone who's guiding you through something, there's another layer to it. So we learned a lot. We learned a lot by doing that exhibition, and the skills development of the team has been significant, not just in terms of the technical skills, but also in terms of those resilient skills around adaptability and connecting with people and doing all that sort of stuff as well.
Fantastic. Okay, hi Kristin. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. You started off your presentation with a reflection on complexity, which for me, from a pedagogical point of view, is very important, because I do endorse your statement that, you know, we are living in a very complex world, and therefore we need to complexify, you know, our understanding and our engagement with the world. And yet we are living in a world of, you know, quick fixes, instant coffees, you know, fast food, small bites, etc. So my question would be, how do you achieve a level of palatable complexity through your exhibitions? And on the other side, how do people, you know, interact with that complexity?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if I can answer that yet. The exhibition that we've It's Complicated exhibition that we're launching in February is all about complex systems. And it was specifically designed because I wanted to do an exhibition that helped young people think about climate. But at that stage, I didn't want to have an exhibition around climate change because I thought we'd just talk to the people who are already engaged in climate. Because, you know, a few years ago, that debate was still so polarized. I think that is changing. But a few years ago, it was so polarized, and I didn't want to only get climate enthusiasts in. I wanted to get the people who were sitting on the fence or who didn't really care. And I thought to do that, to have a good conversation around climate, we have to move beyond the individual actions. And we have to move to understanding what some of the systemic changes that we need. You know, because an individual can only reduce so much of their carbon. And if we're not doing that as a system, we're barely making a difference. And so It's Complicated was born out of this desire to scaffold young people's thinking around complex systems so they could have better discussions around climate that move beyond the individual. So how will that work? I can probably tell you in a year's time to see if we've been effective in shifting the types of conversations. I think some of the conversations we've had
for these conversations, how do you gauge, you know, the level of complexity, the starting point at least, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose we've done that a little bit with 7 Siblings of the Future as well, because that's thinking about the future of Australia, you know, and of Finland in MUŻ.X as well, but the future of Australia in 2050. And because that exhibition takes the mindset of 7 siblings with different values and different interests trying to negotiate the future, that in itself is a complex system. And so that's been good, because what we've done with that one particularly is try and get people to identify with one position and then kind of argue it out and take those different perspectives. So perspective taking is one of those things that I think helps us better understand a complex system. I can understand my position. Can I also understand exactly where somebody else is coming from? Can I understand a tricky negotiation about how we might evolve something? And again, that's come through the conversations that people have had with the moderators. I think it's still really tricky. It's still really tricky. I don't think I've got a good answer. I mean, I think we are one of the future's tenets, if you like, that we've got in is that we've got those staff on the floor to have conversations. That's their role. So yes, they make sure things work. Yes, they're making sure people are safe. Yes, they're making sure things aren't stolen. But really, the guts of that role is to engage people in conversation wherever those people are at. So it's not about necessarily giving them all of the knowledge they need, but about striking up a conversation with their interest and then having a dialogue. And that principle of dialogue and negotiation as being critical for negotiating the future is something we're trying to model. I think we're making some impact, but I don't know. I don't know. It's hard, and maybe it is one of those emergent things that we just have to wait and see and look back in 10 years' time.
Yeah, we are living in a somewhat liquid, existence, so to speak, in a liquid world. And yet, if we want to achieve a certain level of change, I think permanence is of the essence. How do you reconcile the ephemerality of the museum experience with permanence, if transformation for us is key?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what we're trying to do around getting some literacy around complex systems and futures literacy as well, because I think when most people think about change, they think about a step change. We're going here, now we're going to change, now we're going to get, like Mike was saying, we'll get back to the new normal, we'll get back to something, and then things will be stable again. But a systems thinking mindset understands that things aren't stable, they are stable maybe, but they're not still. They're not set. Things are moving all of the time, and they're dynamic. And so getting that sense of dynamism in something, I think is more, for me, is more important than necessarily worrying about the state of permanence.
Another question would be around, knowledge production. And my question would be, what happens to the knowledge produced through the exhibition?
Yes, I mean, it's interesting that you should ask that question, because we're really thinking about legacy stuff at the moment, because our exhibitions are not permanent exhibitions. They happen for a period of time. I'd mentioned financial restraints, so we're moving from 2 exhibitions a year to 1 exhibition a year, but it's still an exhibition that's meant to go and just to be there for a short time. And so some of the things that we're thinking about are around what aspects of those exhibitions do we want to preserve so that people can continue to interact with them. And that's sort of some of the stuff that we would then put online, like the Twitter measure for happiness, the Hedonometer that's then gone online, or 7 Siblings online. The other thing is we run a series of impact surveys. And so, one of our remits is to showcase research to our community and to see if they've understood that research, or if they've, if they're impacted by understanding that research. And so for several of our exhibits, we spend time on the floor actually doing that. We interview them before they go in, we interview them when they go out. Can they describe the concept of the research in their own words now? Do they have a deeper understanding? And that in a way is transmitting that knowledge back into our audience and knowing that they've retained something. We've been doing a research project with the business school at the moment, which is looking at transformational experiences in tourism and looking at the role of museums really in providing those transformational experiences. So that's another way that we're trying to capture stuff. And then the other way that we're trying to do it is by lengthening the engagement with the exhibition through co-design and evaluation with our audience. So one of the things we've just done is a project with year 11 and 12 students, just a small pilot project. In South Australia, they have to do like a 9-month-long research project as part of their senior schooling. And so what we've done is we've worked with a school and we've given them a list of provocations that we're exploring in an upcoming exhibition. And the students have said, I'm really interested in exploring data privacy. I'm really interested in exploring the ethics of military spending. And then we've worked with them to connect researchers within our university to help inform their research projects. But the aim of that is, the student will then spend 9 months doing this research project. They'll be an expert in that field at the end of 9 months. And then we have young people who have expertise that can come and share their knowledge with other young people through programs and through written work that sort of sits online as around the exhibition. So I think it's kind of all of those bits and pieces with that strong core of belonging and navigation, which is, we're really just helping people scan the environment and getting information in so that then they can act on it. And we're not trying to make sure they know everything. It's really about making sure that we're connecting with the thing that person is excited by.
Yeah, to connect with what you're saying, Kristin, this is my final question. You in the plural, you're not innocent or neutral in all this. You have an agenda. Now, pedagogically, in your dialogue with different publics, how do you, deal with counter discourses?
I think it's through the dialogue. So, so obviously I'm thinking about, I have a very clear agenda personally about what I want the world to look like. I want us to be more connected to country and the environment. I want us to be more equitable. I want us to manage climate. I want there to be meaningful work for people. But I'm also personally pretty flexible on how we get there. I think there are a range of ways that we can do that, and I think there are a range of belief systems that could work together to deliver that. So that's kind of the position that I take. I'm sitting within an organisation, the University of South Australia, which also has positions. So their positions are around accessible education. It's around knowledge production. It's around contributing to the economic output for the state. So I think those things match fairly nicely. I might not be always aligned with the Vice Chancellor of my institution, but close enough for us to be able to work together on those things. So then the question comes, in the partners we're working with, or in the publics that we're working with, how do we deal with conflict and dissent? And then I think it's through those conversations. So it's about it's about making our assumptions clear, but not holding on to them too strongly. So it's not didactic. It's, you know, a strong opinion held lightly is probably the approach. And you know, I have a casual staff who all bring their own perceptions and beliefs as well. So it's about letting them have those discussions. And most of the way that we manage dissent and conflict is just through questioning. So it's not about providing the one right answer or getting people to understand the one right thing, because research doesn't do that anyway. Research is always about asking questions. And so for us, having this mode where it's led by provocations, it's led by questions, it's led by things being unresolved, is probably our pedagogical approach, as opposed to to having the content. I've called this a museum of discovery because discovery is continuous. You know, you don't finish a process of discovery, I don't think. And so that constant questioning is kind of inherent, I think, in the way that we approach that, which is really frustrating for some people. And I get that if people are looking for an answer, but we want them to find the answer for them, and hopefully be inspired to find their answer rather than it coming from us.
Okay, Sandro, any questions?
I think we're close to a wrap now. I mean, and there are some more questions which I will be forwarding on email, because I believe we will be going well over time. But thank you once again, Kristin. I think Carmel will be wrapping up now.
So yes, on behalf of the Department of Arts, Open Communities and Adult Education, I thank you, Kristin, for your excellent, presentation, very thoughtful and thought-provoking, presentation. I want to thank you, Mike, for following up on Kristin's presentation, all the technical stuff here, and all those who joined us for this conversation. The next conversation will happen on Saturday, this coming Saturday, 6th December at 9:30 CET time, and it will be with Sak Chan, okay, who is the Chief Experience Officer at the Australian Centre for the Moving Image. So 5th, is it 5th? Okay, 5th December, sorry. Okay,
on Saturday.
5th December on Saturday, 9:30 CET. So goodbye to everyone. And until then, okay, Saha, as we say in Maltese. Ciao.
Thank you, Natalia.
Bye-bye.